Good day, everyone, and welcome to the Patty and Michael podcast, live from the Charlottetown waterfront in our beautiful recording studio located in a Ford F-150. Today, in our unhinged, unscripted, unprepared for podcast, we're going to discuss a question that came up in the last week, and it's a common question I've heard over the last 2 decades, and that is, what are well and septics all about? And that versus city services. So today, maybe we'll just touch on the water first, and we'll get into sewage and septic second. This is definitely going to be a very exciting podcast. So say hello, Patty.
Hello. Exciting. Talking about water and
Sewage.
sewage is exciting. I'm looking forward to hearing how you spin this.
Yes, it's going to be an exciting topic. So essentially, these people were asking is, what is well and septic all about? So we'll discuss wells first. In Prince Edward Island, like many places, your water comes from typically a hole in the ground, whether that's a drilled well, dug well, or it's a spring-fed well. Whether you're in the city or you're out in the country, it's going to come from the ground. And then, typically, if you're in the city, they're going to store it in a large water tower or some sort of storage system to disperse the water amongst its citizens in that municipality or community. In PEI, when you're outside of the major centers, Charlottetown, Stratford, Cornwall, Summerside, if you want to call them major, larger cities, you would be on a municipal service. So the water would be piped to the house, and the city or municipality would be responsible for testing it. When you test water, you typically test it for chemicals and bacteria. One of those tests can be done almost instantaneously. The other one, they have to grow a bacteria or something, and it can take a week or two to get that processed, depending on the backlog. When you're in the country, you're typically going to be on a well. Most wells are going to be a drilled well with a solid metal casement. Looks like a large, thick pipe going down into the ground anywhere between, from what I've seen, 80 to 135 feet, which is a lot less than you'd have to do in places like Ontario and other places where you're drilling through hundreds and hundreds of feet of bedrock in some cases. Wells are typically very inexpensive here, comparatively speaking, because we're just going through soil for the most part, and that's why back in the old days, you'd grab a couple of shovels with your family members, you'd drill a hole, someone would dangerously climb into that hole, they would put a, probably like a brick wall around it. Would you call it a wall? You've seen them before.
Just like an encasement.
Yeah, sort of a brick encasement. It's dangerous work, and then the water would end up in the hole, and then they use a bucket or a hand pump to get the water out of the hole. Today, most of them are all, 99% of them or more, are drilled wells. And when you have water services in PEI, if you're in the country or a cottage, let's say, just opening this up a bit, your water supply is going to come for a well. If you're in a community where they couldn't get good water because of salinity, salt, or other contamination, or environmental things, where they didn't want people drilling a million holes in a community, you would have a community water service where they would have one common well or more, sometimes 2 or 3, supplying a common water service that would be piped to the cottages or the houses. Don't typically see this unless it's either in an area that's problematic where they couldn't get water from, where they had to drill a well a long ways back from the water in order to hit a vein, or they're doing it for luxury purposes. The latter is very rare. It's usually done because of necessity. Other forms of water supplies you're going to see shared wells, which is something I would steer away from. I would probably suggest if you do buy something with a shared well, you have the ability to install your own well so you're not hooked up to one or more neighbors, because then you're going to get into questions about who powers the well, because there is an electric pump that is either A, it's installed in the pipe underneath the ground, that's a submersible. That's the more modern ones where they feed electricity down to the pump. And then the older ones are a well that would be in the structure or a pump house or in the basement, and it would pump the water from the well to the house. And of course, the other question is, well, what's the pressure like? The pressure typically is very, very good, and it's whatever you set it for, which is usually around 90 psi plus or minus.
Yeah, and the other thing with shared wells is if you're the one who's welled, who doesn't have, say, direct access because it's on the adjacent property, you're kind of at the mercy of the other person, trusting. You have to have a good relationship, a written agreement in place, because you're waiting for them to agree to do their water testing. A lot of these shared wells were put into place because they were selling or severing off pieces of land for family members. But, over the years, especially the last, I'd say, 8 years on PEI, a lot of these homes are being sold to outside or non-family members. And this is where we find some of these, odd situations, because it also happens with septic as well. But just another point, Michael, just to make sure people are aware of.
Right. And if you do have more questions about pricing wells or installing them or timelines, Patty and I can supply you with a list of people that do a great job at well installation, which is usually interfaced with an electrician, which is going to handle the electrical component, and the two combined will give you a water source. With respect to water, regardless of whether it's coming out of your own well, shared well, or a municipal spring or well, it should be tested. A lot of people feel that their water smells good. They've been showering with it for 20 years, and of course, they got the best water in the whole universe. And then you go to test it, and you find out, no, you don't, because the bacteria level is through the roof, and you guys should all be dead.
It doesn't even have to be through the roof. A fail is a 1. So
right, but there's been cases where people will go on and brag about how great their water is, and then you find out their water comes out of the tap purple. No, you're wondering, what's wrong with this water? I would suggest, especially since it is now free in Prince Edward Island, to have your water tested at least once a year.
For now, they aren't guaranteeing how long they're doing it, so it is something that I would recommend if the listener is listening. We're not making any promises that it is free. Province is subject to change this at any time.
Right, but even when it wasn't free, it wasn't that expensive if you did it yourself. Yeah. Now, when you go to sell a property, since this is a real estate podcast, it is not a requirement legally to have a water test done from the point of conveyance. In other words, as far as the government's concerned, if you want to buy a house with or without water, good water, bad water, no water, you can do that. From the mortgage holder's perspective, since they're probably buying the majority of that property, because most people come in with 20, 30% down, 5%, they want to make sure they have a viable product or house, cottage to sell in the case of default. So they will look for a proper water test, which would be both bacteria and chemical tests. When you do the tests, make sure you get both of them. Tourism only requires one, oddly enough. I have no idea why. It's like half checking a house or a car when you have it inspected. For purposes of a conveyance, they want bacteria and chemical. Of course, it all relies on your contract. So whatever your contract says as far as water tests, that's what you have to abide by. Some of those contracts will say that the Prince Edward Island government has to test them. In the past, we've used companies in Nova Scotia and other provinces to test when we couldn't get it tested in PEI or they are backlogged. When you go to sell a property, I suggest you do it right away. It is usually good for between 3 and 6 months from a mortgage holder's perspective. They want to see it done within 90 days or 180 days. Anything to...
Yep, and that is something that sometimes we don't even know if a lender, a bank, changes their requirements until we're close to closing, and then they end up letting us know, because most people don't do their water test or have their water test in place until closer to closing. And then if there is any issues, or if they took it because you listed your property a year ago, it finally came to sell, closing date is today, but now the water sample is considered expired. Yeah, so it's all up to the lender, and there's no black and white. We don't have a list of who would approve and who wouldn't.
Who would approve what?
A water test based on if it was only 90 days or if it...
No, because those policies could change any time.
Absolutely.
It used to be 6 months for all of them, and a few of them decided to change it to 90 days to be more adverse from liability, probably.
Correct.
Now, let's just assume I'm buying a cottage in the middle of the winter and the water pipes aren't insulated, the well's been turned off, there's ethylglycol antifreeze, is that what you call it, going through all the lines, and I can't get a water test done. What do we do from the point of a purchaser?
Well, if I was representing the seller in this instance, I would...
Or you're not representing the purchaser.
I realize that. If I was representing the seller, I would have had my seller, before they winterize the house, collect a water sample just in the case an offer were to come in. If I'm representing the purchaser, again, it comes back to their lenders and how strong a confident of a buyer. I know you've just had a whole experience and you've got experience in this, Michael, but I either would delay the closing or see if the seller will work with me to de-winterize the house, collect the sample, and winterize it.
Well, you can't winterize it because it's 30 below zero and the pipes are going to freeze instantly, and
if there's no heat
80 mile per hour wind every day.
Yeah, then that's poor planning on the listing agent's part, in my opinion, to have not had a sample collected before it was winterized.
Well, that's good advice. From a purchaser's perspective, you can buy a property without a water test. It all comes down to your aversion to risk. It's always a good idea to understand what you're dealing with monetarily. That's why you will contact the well drilling company or companies that we suggest to get an approximation of what it would cost for a new well. So the deal Patty was talking about that I worked on recently, they're basically getting a $40,000 or more discount off a $200,000 cottage. So they're perfectly happy to close without a water test. And what they did, and this is totally up to the discretion of the bank, they don't need a water test. They're going to tell you they do, but they don't. So they just said to the bank, we're not getting a water test done because we can't, but we want to buy this property. And the bank agreed with that, and they decided to close it. In the event that the bank didn't agree, they're certainly welcome to look at other lenders that were willing to close without a water test. So it's all up to you whether you want that water test in your lender, if you do have a lender supplying a mortgage that may or may not have that requirement. What do we do in a case that the water test fails?
Well, that's a good point. And if a water test fails, and a fail is a 1+,
Well, we don't have to get into the technicals.
So typically, most lenders will allow and proceed with a closing, however, will request a holdback for typically the sum of a new well, depending on where the property is. I've had one property that was a waterfront property that had saltwater intrusion. The lenders wanted $12,000 held back.
$12,000?
Just because of how deep they had to go with this well to try to avoid the saltwater intrusion. Typically, it's around $8,000 as of when we're taping this podcast.
Well, it was $2,500, then it was $3,500.
Yes,
some lawyers got overly amorous, and it was $4,500, and then $5,500. That number comes down to what you mutually agree on. So just because they say they want a $12,000 holdback doesn't mean you have to say, okay. You can say no. We'll give you $4,000 or $6,000, or make a phone call to a well drilling company, because $12,000 is ridiculous.
So whatever the clients,
they're not drilling to the core of the earth.
Mutually agree and the lender approves.
Right, and it would also depend on the water test paragraph and how it's written. In the past, we've had water test paragraphs written where they say, well, the vendor may fix the problem. Well, that doesn't mean they have to. They just may.
It says it shall. Vendor shall or sellers shall replace if remediation is needed. But it also could imply they shall not.
No, it said may. Shall and would imply that they have to. It used to say may. So read the water test paragraph, which may change from time to time, or maybe it's something you've written in a custom sense or modified by a lawyer or an agent.
And refer to your province too, because each province has their own regulations and requirements. We're just talking about how things are here on Prince Edward Island.
As far as what is potable or drinkable, consumable, showerable, bathable water. And that goes back to the point where you really need to do your tests early on, because if you have a bad test, then you need 2 good tests. So now you could be in a month and a half, 2 months, depending on the backlog. Would you agree?
Yeah, and depending on the issue at hand.
And we're running out of time here.
Yeah, so I think we've covered the water and...
we didn't cover septic.
And I was going to say, why don't we do that as a part 2 to this podcast? Because it's too much information to get into. And we obviously, exciting, Michael, as you said, there's so much information to cover with regards to water, more than I think people realize.
The water tests have to be done by an independent third party that's not attached to the transaction. It can't be you or your husband or wife or your brother. It should be somebody that's not connected to the transaction, ideally a plumber, because if there's anything to fix, they can usually find a resolution.
Yeah, and your water testing should be done on the onset of the listing, because on our listing contracts, we have to, within the property condition disclosure statement, assuming the client fills that out, has to say if there's are they aware of any problems with the water? And if they check no, and no, well, they should come from a position of actually being able to support those original answers. So when I take a listing, I always tell my clients when they're on well, it's in your best interest while you have time and are controlling things to go ahead and get a water test, get bacteria, get chemical. Currently it's free with the province, which is absolutely wonderful. Yes, my sellers can take those tests, the samples themselves, but then they feel more in control. They're not stressed. I've not set them up for a lot of
They don't want to take the test themselves because then they can't be used for the purposes of the conveyance.
Well, I realize that, but I'm just getting ready to take this listing. I do let them know if we get a quick sale, they're going to have to pay to have someone else come in
Why
and
don't you
do
just
it.
get them to pay and get someone to do it? There are
I
water
leave that
test
up to them.
companies too. Well, that's silly
It's not silly.
because you're going through the process multiple times.
No, and I make them aware. They make the call themselves.
I think it's silly.
I educate. That's my job and responsibility. If I feel it's a hot property or one that might end up generating a sale earlier than later, I definitely advise them to get a third party who does not have a vested interest in the sale of the property to collect the water sample.
Perfect.
That's a drop in the bucket.
See ya. That's it. Say goodbye.
Goodbye.